Okay? So what can we know about the origins of the universe and life? Now, some of this about the origins of the universe, that's going to be a bit of a repeat for you, but I think it's important to walk through it again. So the origin of the universe, you probably remember this slide, the globular cluster. I just kind of used that, if you recall, because it kind of looks like a Big Bang. Not really, it's just a globular cluster. So, first of all, the universe had a beginning, they're telling us now. The universe had a beginning. And what we know philosophically is that anything that had a beginning must have been caused by something else. The universe cannot cause itself to come into existence. Therefore, the universe was caused by something else. Now, technically, philosophically, that's all you can know for sure. I put in parentheses a creator, because that's where obviously we're going to go. But so this is a syllogism. Those first two statements are true, and therefore the conclusion is likely to be true. Okay? And you remember Calvin and Hobbes, I hope. If you don't have these cartoon books at home, I would encourage you to get them. They're extremely funny. And of course, Calvin thinks the Big Bang is just really boring. And he came up with the horrendous space kablooey. And he also thought that the Tyrannosaur should be called Monstrous Killer Death Lizard. Probably better than Tyrannosaurus Rex, huh? Okay, so cosmology's Big Bang. Now, they come up with this statement because as they observed that the universe seems to be expanding, galaxies seem to be getting farther and farther away from each other. And if you start running the clock backwards, this is what you come to. Notice how I've put the word particle in what are called scare quotes. It can't really be an actual particle. Why? Because it occupied no space. Matter is something that has mass and occupies space. If this quote-unquote particle did not occupy any space, then it can't really be matter. So what this particle was, where it came from, they don't like to talk about it. So now this first statement here, something must be eternal. Why would we say that?
Something has to be outside of the system to create the system. And since we have time and something began, something has to be outside the system that didn't begin, it was always there.
Right, but why must it have always been there? Why is that?
Well, because otherwise you just keep going into the same predicament.
Yes.
So something had to create it.
Something had to cause it to come into existence. So something has to be eternal, because something can't come from nothing. Even Julie Andrews got that right, The Sound of Music. Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could. Then she follows up with the really bad. So somewhere in my youth or childhood must have done something good. Well, that doesn't work out. That doesn't do anything. Okay. So we know also that the material universe had a beginning, and therefore the material universe is not eternal. The conclusion here of this syllogism, something immaterial, spiritual or supernatural, must be eternal. What do I mean by the term supernatural? What does that mean?
Otherworldly.
Okay, otherworldly.
Well, natural is what we can observe, I guess, in our world. So supernatural is something we can't necessarily observe. Maybe is that? Well,
God is not a part of creation. He created it, but he's not a part of it, as with pantheism. Okay. So,
what's the root word of supernatural? This is not a trick question.
Is it natural?
Yeah, natural.
Okay, so what does super mean?
Like beyond, above,
greater. Or, yeah, beyond, above. Is that?
Mm-hmm. So, the whole idea of supernatural, because it's so easy for people to think of either ghosts or angels. It just means something outside of nature, outside of the material universe.
So, now, with the philosophical syllogism here, you can't really choose between immaterial, spiritual, or supernatural. It's just one of those three. It's just three possibilities. Now, we've talked about some of the reactions to this. Now, this one you haven't seen. It's from the theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking. He said, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist.
It doesn't seem like it really explains anything.
Well, what's the first statement? Because there is a law such as gravity. But in order to have gravity, what must you have?
Matter.
You must have matter. But if there's no matter, how can you have gravity? So he's already, as brilliant as he is, he's indicating that somehow without matter, a law of gravity would have already existed. Now that therefore tells you something was already there. There was a law of gravity, if nothing else. And usually that requires there to be some matter as well. So as brilliant as he can be, well, how did you rephrase this yesterday?
He was brilliant, but he was also foolish. One of the students yesterday said, that's silly. But that's what he says there. That's just flat out silly.
Yeah.
By the way, do you know who Stephen Hawking is? Does an image
Yes.
come to mind? Cole, what were you going to say?
Well, like for an image, I think he's like paralyzed in a wheelchair.
Yeah, he had Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. So he kept losing and losing his ability to move and speak. He ended up needing to have a computer speak for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, this brilliant mind was trapped in a body that just kept falling apart on him. He was brilliant. God gave him a great mind, but he resorted to that to avoid the possibility of there being a God.
Yeah.
He did not want there to be a God.
And part of it was, if there was a God, why would he have allowed this to happen to him? Why would he get Lou Gehrig's disease? Originally, he was married to a believer. But eventually, and she helped really get him started, and she took care of him when the ALS showed up, and eventually he divorced her. To his detriment, I think. Further reactions here. Arthur Eddington, philosophically, and notice what he says, philosophically, the notion of a beginning is repugnant to me. What's that mean? Repugnant.
Like disgusting.
Disgusting, yes. I should like to find a genuine loophole. We must allow evolution and infinite time to get started. He doesn't have infinite time. If the universe had a beginning, evolution does not have an infinite time to get started. And then from Edmund Whittaker, I mean, this really says it all. It is simpler to postulate creation ex nihilo, divine will constituting nature out of nothingness. He says that's simpler than this idea of a big bang from a particle that was infinitely dense and occupied no space. That just works out better. And then we have this from George Greenstein. As we survey all the evidence, the thought insistently arises that some supernatural agency must be involved. Is it possible that suddenly, without intending to, we have stumbled upon scientific proof of the existence of a supreme being? Now, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, you can't really prove anything in science. You can prove something false, but you can't prove something to be true. But at the same time, that phrase, without intending to, they were looking for an infinitely old universe. That's what they were expecting. That's what they were, in some respects, hoping for. But when they found this idea of a beginning, well, to one guy, it was repugnant to him. And again, it's stumbled upon. Weren't looking for that. And this last one says, if we need an atheist for a debate, I go to the philosophy department. The physics department isn't much use. Why would you say that? Physics department isn't much use. Faith, what do you think? No? Amar? Any idea? Cole?
Maybe because like people like philosophers are like theoretical and like I guess God would.
But why did we say the physics department isn't much use? Andrew?
I'd say because the physical proof points to God.
Yeah. This one. The physics seems to point to a supreme being. So if you want an atheist, he goes to the plot because physics department isn't going to be much use. They're too aware of the physical constraints and this idea of the Big Bang and the possibility of supernatural. So we come to this final statement from Robert Jastrow in his book, God and the Astronomers. He says, for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. Not what the astronomers and physicists were looking for. Questions? Origin of the universe. Got that pretty well squared away? Pretty well? Okay. Now we're going to switch to the origin of life. So all of this is going to be new to you. And I'm going to play you a video clip here. Anybody know who Carl Sagan is?
Heard the name.
You've heard the name. Well, he's no longer alive, but he was a former planetary astronomer from Cornell University. And back in the 80s, he produced a television series for PBS called Cosmos. And we played the opening clip from that a few weeks ago. Cosmos is all it is, ever was or ever will be. That was Carl Sagan. Now he's going to talk about this idea of the origin of life. Any thoughts? Don't you love the way he says the word billion?
No.
Okay. So this is Stanley Miller before his experimental apparatus. Is a little bit different than what Sagan just showed you, but doesn't really matter. He already told you ammonia, methane, water, and hydrogen gases they thought were a part of this early atmosphere. I love this cartoon. It says, if I can just synthesize life here, then I'll have proven that no intelligence was necessary to form life in the beginning. What kind of intelligence is he speaking for himself here? Okay. So here's the actual Stanley Miller apparatus. Now what you see over here, this is a bulb with water in it. Now it's being heated by a Bunsen burner, so the water is boiling. Okay. So there's a flow comes up around here, and here are where the other gases, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen gas, are introduced, and it's carried along with the water vapor, and here's that spark chamber that he used. And then the flow continues because of the boiling water, and here is what's called a condenser. So cool water comes in, and it cools down what's inside the apparatus there, so it goes from vapor to liquid. And then the liquid drops down, and he collected things here in the flask beneath. So organic compounds. There were a few amino acids. Sagan really exaggerates what you would find. So the four gases, just mentioned those. What was not present?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. If you put oxygen in that chamber, what would happen?
Probably not work.
What's methane? It's natural gas.
Oh, so it would,
It would blow up, yes. Oxygen were there, it would blow up. Not a good result. And obviously the reactants were pure. Now, problems in chemical evolution here. First one, these early Earth gases, particularly ammonia and methane, would not have lasted very long because with ultraviolet light, ammonia, which is NH3, with ultraviolet light breaks down into nitrogen gas and hydrogen gas. It's likely that if there was ammonia in the early Earth, it would have lasted maybe just a few thousand years, not much longer than that. Same thing with methane. Methane is a single carbon with 4 hydrogens, and with ultraviolet light, it gets the carbons that get strung together into long chain hydrocarbons, and they would not have been gaseous, and they would fall to the surface of the Earth, and so methane also would not have lasted much longer than a few thousand years. So we have the breakup of the early Earth gases, and there were multiple and low-level energy sources. Now, in Urey's experiment, Miller's experiment, he just had sparking to simulate lightning. But there would also have been ultraviolet light. There would have been thermal shock waves, all kinds of energy sources in that early Earth. And many of them would have broken down these processes. The products would have been broken down before ever reaching the ocean. So if there were amino acids formed, if there were some nucleic acids formed, nucleotides, they would have been destroyed before they ever reached the surface of the Earth. Anybody ever heard of the prebiotic soup? Prebiotic soup, if these amino acids and nucleotides were rained down onto the Earth, they would have collected perhaps in small warm ponds, as Darwin envisioned, and this would be called a prebiotic soup. Okay? But the problem with this idea is that it would mix the building blocks together. If you're going to form proteins out of amino acids, you have to have just a solution of just amino acids. Because amino acids will react with nucleotides. They'll react with glucose molecules, sugar molecules. So
Could you define prebiotic?
Well, pre means, but what's biotic?
life.
Life, and pre,
Four.
before life. Okay. So the amino acid, nucleotides, lipids, sugars would all have been mixed together. You would not get proteins or nucleic acids or carbohydrates because they're all reacting with each other. You have to somehow isolate the amino acids just with amino acids, somehow isolate the nucleotides with just nucleotides. And there's no mechanism for that to happen on its own. So, primordial soup. Forgot my can again. Because this is not the same thing. Yeah, Fermilabs. So, problems. Breakup of the early Earth gases, multiple low-level energy sources, products broken down before reaching the ocean, prebiotic soup mixes the building blocks together, and there would have had to have been some low level of oxygen. Why? Because again, with ultraviolet light. Water is broken down into hydrogen and oxygen by ultraviolet light. So there would always have been some small but continuous supply of oxygen. Now, this atmosphere of methane, ammonia, hydrogen has been called a reducing atmosphere. And now they realize that likely never existed. And so they've tried different sources of carbon and nitrogen. Carbon, they think of carbon dioxide, maybe carbon monoxide, maybe for nitrogen it would be nitrogen oxides, nitrogen dioxide. But those atmospheres just don't work very well. You hardly get any kind of result out of that. And so would there have been even any kind of prebiotic soup? Now, Faxon, Bradley, and Olson wrote a book back in the 70s called The Mystery of Life's Origin. And one of their concluding statements was, furthermore, no geological evidence indicates an organic soup, even a small organic pond, ever existed on this planet. May therefore with fairness call this scenario the myth of the prebiotic soup. So you look through all of the geological formations that would have been formed, or supposedly around this time, okay? And there is no evidence of any kind of an organic anything, any time in the early Earth's history, until you start having living things showing up. But prebiotic soup, no such geological evidence available. So, questions? Convinced this likely couldn't happen on its own? Okay.
So if it didn't happen like through chemical evolution, where did life come from?
I guess it came from God.
Something immaterial, spiritual, or supernatural, as we spoke of earlier. Okay. Now we need to talk about this idea of biological information. Now, first of all, chaos does not give rise to order. Does that make sense? Okay. And noise does not give rise to information. Back in the old days, when we were teenagers and young adults, you had radios in your car that had a dial to change stations. And there were no even punch buttons yet to do any of that sort of thing. And so you could, in between stations, you get the static. Now let's just say you just went ahead and left the dial between stations, so all you were hearing was this nasty static. And perhaps you would say, if I just wait long enough, eventually Beethoven's Fifth Symphony would just suddenly arise out of the static. Anybody believe that? No, that's not going to happen. Look at this. What do you see?
Ripples in the sand.
Ripples in the sand. Is there order there? Well,
I mean, it has a pattern to
there's a
it.
pattern. There is a pattern to it, okay? And that's simply due to the action of the waves and the type of sand grains you have. But it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Okay? Go a little further down the beach and you see this. And that's Ray, not Roy. Okay. Is this just the results of sand, wind, and waves? How do you know that?
It's very unlikely
Well, why is it unlikely?
because you would assume that someone wrote that.
You would assume that, but why?
Well, you've seen it before, probably.
Maybe you've seen it before. Well, what you're seeing are precise symbols, the letters of our alphabet. And they're written in a sequence. And the sequence of letters are arranged into 3 groups. And they each spell out a word that you're familiar with. So this would never happen, and it communicates a message. Do you know who wrote it?
Ray, probably.
Probably, but do you know?
Not necessarily.
Could have been George. Yeah. You have no idea. Is it true?
Possibly.
Possibly, but you don't really know, do you? But you know it's a message, and it had to come from a human intelligence. Okay? Doesn't matter who wrote it, doesn't matter whether it's true or not, it's clearly a message. Now, when you look at the DNA, nucleotides A, G, C, T, okay? Those are like letters in our alphabet. Codons, which are groups of 3, are like words. Also, each codon codes for a specific amino acid. You put words together, you get sentences. You put codons and amino acids together, you get genes and proteins. You put sentences together, you get a chapter or a book. You put genes and proteins together, you get chromosomes. You put books together, you get a library. Put chromosomes together, you have a genome. There's clearly information here. The DNA informational code requires intelligent pre-program. You know what's missing here? My slides of Fred and mowing the grass.
Oh, well, you showed them already
Oh,
in a previous
okay.
talk.
Questions? Believe that? Now, one of the things that Sagan mentioned towards the end was that we don't know anything about the origin of the genetic code. Well, they never will. It's not going to happen on its own. Again, any kind of a code requires a coder. It's just not going to happen by random chance. So what do we learn here? God is loving and caring, He's omnipotent, and He's eternal. And now we learn that He's also quite intelligent.